Friends, welcome to Zealots at the Gate, a Comment original podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen. Send us an email with feedback, questions at zealots@comment.org, and make sure you tag us on social media. I'm Matthew Kamick.
And I'm Shadi Hamid. Matt and I are good friends, but maybe you wouldn't expect that. Matt's Christian, I'm Muslim. Matt's conservative, I'm sort of liberal. Matt's white, I'm brown. Also, Matt's a theologian, I'm a political scientist.
Together we research religion, politics, and the future of democracy at Georgetown University. Thanks for joining us. All right, Shadi. Well, hey, we've got a new season. You ready to go?
I'm ready. Let's do it. What are we talking about?
Well, I was thinking that, America's turning 250. Big year for us. And being a podcast on religion and politics and culture, I thought we'd sort of take the temperature first. So in these first couple episodes, we're going to be talking about just the state of the union in terms of religion and politics in America. And, we've just finished up this book, and a big part of the book is talking about how there's kind of a paradox at the heart of religion and politics today. For many years, political theorists imagined that as the West became more secular, its politics would become more rational and calm, that religion leads to division and passion and irrationality, and that as we become more secular, things would be just more chill, more rational.
Hasn't turned out that way.
Yeah. So how would you describe politics in America today? Would you describe it as rational and calm?
It feels more like a holy war. And that's the paradox, I think, that we're pointing to. How is it possible that with the decline of religion, and public religion in particular, that we actually see a kind of outburst of passion, of irrationality? It's not what we would have expected.
Yeah, so I think I want to try out a thesis on you.
Okay.
And I imagine we're going to have a little bit of disagreement on this, but I think what I'd like to do is sort of divide up our conversation looking at how faith in politics is working on the political right, and then how faith in politics is working on the political left. So here's my thesis. Here's what I want to try out on you, is that essentially what's happening is we're moving from a religious society to what I would call a spiritually passionate society. That in the past, America had traditional religions, institutional religions. People went to church, they went to mosque, they went to synagogue. They were part of these institutional religions. They focused on a specific text and tradition. Today, people are leaving institutional religion, but they're not leaving for a state of sort of rationality, a sort of deep secularism. They're becoming part of sort of like spiritual movements on the political left and the political right, and that they're actually seeking meaning and purpose and value in and through political tribes.
Yeah,
that these tribes on the right and on the left are sort of spiritually charged, and that to become a part of these political tribes, it's exciting, it's emotional, it's experiential, and the politics is really becoming more apocalyptic in its shape. So what I thought we'd do is start out with a discussion on the political right, and then maybe in the next episode we'll jump into talking about what this looks like on the left. So for me, I think that I'm seeing two things going on in the political right. One is we have a sort of rise in the alt-right of a sort of quasi-pagan, like white European movement of blood and soil sort of developing. And then we also have the evangelical right, or what's sometimes like the Christian nationalist right, which is still somewhat tied to Christianity, but in kind of a difficult way to, it's somewhat difficult to connect, a figure like Donald Trump, for example, someone who money, gold, greed, women. I think he has 10 children now from 3 different wives.
I don't know if it's 10, but yeah, he has quite a few.
How many kids does he have? Okay, we'll have to look that up. We'll get that for you. He's got a lot of kids.
Yeah.
And he's got a lot of kids, a lot of money, really sort of glorification and power. And we think about sort of the values of Jesus Christ and historic Christianity. The glory of Christianity was not money, power, women, domination, taking over Greenland. That wasn't sort of Jesus's goal. There does seem to be a division there. There seems to be a new form of political religion developing on the right that's distinct from Christianity in some important ways. So I'm wondering, for you, how are you seeing this develop in terms of, I don't know if you agree with my division that we have sort of a neo-pagan right, and then we have a sort of the evangelical Christian nationalist.
Well, I'm reminded of what Ross Douthat once said, I think in 2016. He said, if you don't like the religious right, wait until you see the post-religious right. And I think that was quite prescient, that it's gotten a lot worse. And if only we could go back to the George W. Bush years, not the Iraq part of it, but the kind of more sincere evangelical grounding that actually seemed to be tied to some semblance of Christian morality. Obviously, there's always going to be immorality, but at least it seemed more institutional, more grounded, more aspiring to be like Christ. But we, as you pointed out, we don't see that at all now. We see a Christianity on the evangelical side of things that seems unchristian to a lot of us. I'm an outsider, so it's not really my job to litigate who's truer to the kind of Christ-like vision. But I will say, I'm struck by the Greenland stuff is actually quite a good example, because it's all about might makes right. It's all about domination. It's about power above all else. And my understanding of Christianity, that it privileges the weak and the meek and the poor and the destitute. Those are the people of God. But here we see people who want to lord their power over others. And there's a kind of cruelty to it that seems like the opposite of what Jesus would do. And that's hard for me to understand. And we can kind of unpack that a little bit. It's been a question, I think, on the minds of Christians and non-Christians alike over the past 10 years. How could this have possibly happened to Christianity? How is it that evangelicalism could be shifted to something unrecognizable? And you as an evangelical have a lot of insight into that. I would say, though, I wonder if the religion versus spirituality frame is the best way to talk about this, because it's almost making spirituality sound like it's negative, that we've moved from religion to spirituality, and spirituality is the kind of thing that is chaotic and leads to extremism and so forth, when it's certainly one way of looking at it, but another way of looking at it is that now we have religion without religion. We have the passions of religion, but without the kind of institutional framework, without any kind of constraint, without a higher power to kind of give us a North Star. So we have all this anger, emotion, passion, irrationality, faith, but it's not directed towards anything that can be sort of, it's not directed towards anything in particular, I would say.
Yeah, so I think maybe our Christian audience would be helped out by this metaphor of Catholicism versus Pentecostalism. So Catholicism is very institutional, right? It's a 2,000-year-old institution with texts and tradition and hierarchy and institutions, and you've got a pope who's sort of running it all. As opposed to Pentecostalism, which is not an institution. It's a global charismatic movement that moves with the sort of power of the Spirit. It's very experiential. It's very emotional. And it sort of lends itself to a more movement-oriented thing. And I think that part of what I'm arguing is that politics today is much more experiential, emotional, passionate than it is institutional. That for someone like George W. Bush, he would feel himself somewhat submissive to the institutions and traditions of the church in the way in which Donald Trump does not. And so George W. Bush is more of an institutional Christian, whereas Donald Trump is,
nothing.
nothing. And so, quite frankly, the growth of more charismatic Pentecostal type people who are being drawn into Donald Trump's orbit kind of makes sense a little bit in this kinds of way. So, but I think more broadly speaking, I think that we can talk about the MAGA movement in general as having a sort of spirituality to it. I would argue that you're dressing up in MAGA clothes, you're part of MAGA rallies. There's sort of an emotional, experiential movement orientation to it. It's not really grounded in a text or a tradition, but it actually moves with the spirit of Donald Trump. So essentially, whatever the charismatic leader says we're doing, that's what we're doing. There's not like a consistent dogma of Donald Trump. It's much more of a sort of spiritual movement, I'd argue.
And whatever Donald Trump says at any particular moment that becomes the doctrine. So Trump can kind of go through any number of reversals. He can contradict himself. He can say the opposite of what he said the previous day. But because he's the one who said it, it's something that has to be respected and agreed to by the members of the movement. So in that sense, it's personalistic. It's cult-like. There's a devotion to a leader. In some sense, Christ is replaced by Trump as the North Star of the movement. And that's what makes it, I think, so frightening as an outsider, is where is Christ in all of this?
Yeah. Okay, so I want to shift for a minute actually over to the alt-right.
Yeah, sure.
Because this is, in many ways, blatantly anti-Christian.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that as we read the texts of the alt-right and the messages of the alt-right, and if you follow sort of internet culture of the alt-right, the paganism is actually pretty clear in terms of the use of symbols and images of sort of Northern European strength, whiteness, masculinity, sort of blood and soil, spiritual connection between a people and the land, and the sense of power. I think there are many sort of connections between these. Who would you say are some of the core voices or leaders sort of pushing this form of right-wing neopaganism or exploring?
Yeah, I would say a couple stand out to me. One is Bronze Age Pervert. Another is Curtis Yarvin, both of whom are quite influential, especially with the J.D. Vance wing of the Republican Party. J.D. Vance is very online, and both Bronze Age Pervert and Curtis Yarvin kind of came to their fame as kind of online figures. I see Curtis Yarvin on my Twitter feed all the time. He's always posting and tweeting and so forth. And I think with both of them, they're not religious. Curtis Yarvin is an atheist, although he tries to downplay that or even hide that in conversations because he doesn't want to alienate too much of his constituency. But God does not figure into his discourse. Bronze Age Pervert is very much a kind of Nietzschean might makes right kind of person, that everything is about power and there's a kind of disregard for the weak. He looks down on anyone who is weak and doesn't have power. And it's almost as if you become more moral the more power you have, and the weaker you are, the more immoral. It's almost like you're to blame for your own lack of power, your own lack of control over your own life. There's no real sense of empathy and understanding. And I think that colors a lot of what we see. If we want to kind of draw the analogy to everyday politics, we see ICE's brutality in Minneapolis, for example, and how ICE and police are being very aggressive towards people who don't fit a certain description. That if you're Hispanic sounding, or if you're someone who doesn't seem like a citizen, there's no empathy for that person. There's no empathy for anyone who's on the opposing side. It's very brutal in that sense. And I think that that is really what's animating a lot of the new right under Donald Trump. Yeah, it's very hard. It's very unforgiving.
Yeah.
There's no real give and take. There's no appetite for compromise.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think maybe a core phrase for understanding European paganism is a warrior mentality. That strength, beauty, unity, force, this is the glory of a tribe or a nation. And then I think on the other side is a sort of nihilism, a sort of Nietzschean sense of despair and power, that we live in this time of decay and we need a warrior mentality. And that's all that's left.
Yeah, and I think part of this is tied to the fact that young men in America are struggling on a lot of different metrics. They're falling behind women when it comes to college graduation rates, employment, living in their parents' basements, struggling to find love, being unmarried, not having other male friends. So when you have that kind of crisis of loneliness or despair, and also I should say high suicide rates as well, that you're looking for something that can fill the hole. And if religion doesn't come naturally to you, you're going to look for alternatives to religion. And that's why this fantasy that once religion goes away, everyone is going to be rational and calm, it misunderstood something fundamental about human nature, which is everyone needs a fundamental orientation, a fundamental pivot. We're all faith-based beings. And both of us were big fans of a Dutch theologian, Abraham Kuyper, and this is at the core of his work, this idea that we're all faith-oriented. And that faith can be Christianity, it can be liberalism, it can be nationalism, it can be socialism, but we all need some kind of ideology that drives us because we're meaning makers and we desire meaning and we want something to guide our lives. It's very hard for ordinary human beings to live without that kind of sense of a North Star.
So talk about what that meaning looks like on the alt-right for these young men. Like, how is meaning being made?
Part of it is devotion to a leader, Donald Trump. Part of it is the sense of male dominance and masculinity, that men are superior to women. This is where the whole incel movement comes about, this kind of disdain for women, and a sense that maleness is something that has to be prized. There's also this movement that I'm not really familiar with, but I'll just mention it if people want to look into it. It's called looks maxing. Have you heard of looks maxing?
No.
So it's just a combination of the word looks and maxing. So basically, people will do weird things to their body to optimize their looks.
Okay.
And not just women, because that's more normal, but this is young men doing things like altering their jawline or breaking, stuff like that, just imagine, and finding ways to become 1 or 2 inches taller. I think there's something weird that you do with your legs to get your height up a little bit. But it's this sense that you have to display or present male dominance. And part of that has to do with the way that you look. You have to look like a traditional masculine man with a particular kind of jawline and bone structure. So it's those kinds of things that have come into vogue in recent years in the absence of religion, and they fill the gap that religion once did.
Yeah, so that's consistent once again with European pagan values, which is power, strength, beauty, right? And that meaning is found meaning, purpose, value is found in that sort of combination of power, strength, beauty. And then the last thing I would say is sort of unity and uniformity. So the other thing you and I are interested in is this question of how does America and American democracy hang together amidst so much difference? How do we handle this difference? How do we navigate this difference? And for the alt-right, difference and diversity is seen as weakness. It's seen as decay, and that difference and diversity leads to weakness and national decay and decline. And if America is going to become great again, it's going to need to become more homogenous. That America's strength emerges from its homogeneity. And so this is another critical issue for, you and I who are thinking about pluralism, is that European neopagan alt-right is fundamentally allergic to this kind of diversity and pluralism that you and I are talking about.
Yeah. And that's why I think that immigration enforcement, to use a neutral term, is so critical to the Trumpian vision, because it promises to homogenize the country. And if you listen to someone like Trump's senior advisor, Stephen Miller constantly talks about diversity as a weakness, that it leads to chaos. And this is part of the effort to paint blue cities as kind of havens of extremism and instability,
crime, decay, ugliness,
decadence, all of these things. And that the only way to bring order and stability and law back into the country is by being more uniform. And by that, we can say more white. Even though the MAGA movement, interestingly, has strong elements that, Hispanic men, even black men to some extent, there are pockets of support for MAGA in those circles. But I think that's changing among Hispanics in light of the very aggressive ICE enforcement. But we should say that just because whiteness is the goal, it doesn't mean that it's only white people who support MAGA. There's something, I think, appealing to people more broadly, because I think a lot of us, we desire order. We see our cities and we're like, can't they be better? Aren't they a little bit chaotic? Why can't we have more order? Order is the kind of illusion, it's the kind of promise that a lot of us can fall under the sway of.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the neo-pagan right. And, back onto the evangelical right. So on this side of things, order and unity is found within sort of a dominant American Protestant faith, that America will become strong as it becomes more Protestant, as it becomes more evangelical. And so a partnership needs to be formed between the Christian faith and the state. The state needs to serve Christianity, and Christianity needs to serve the state.
Yeah.
So it seems to me this is sort of that partnership that's going on. And as an evangelical myself, right, this is a very hard thing to watch, and it challenges me in a variety of ways.
For those who are tuning in maybe for the first time to Zealots at the Gate, could you say just a little bit about what kind of evangelical you are and how you feel about that term?
Yeah.
Because we've had conversations where it's like, hey, is evangelical the right label because it has so much political baggage now?
Right. Well, it's a bit like when you call yourself a Democrat and then you're like not so sure if you want to call yourself that. So yes, I'm an evangelical. I grew up within the evangelical faith. The kind of evangelical that I am, I come from the Reformed or the Presbyterian side of that tradition. And so for me, theologians like Abraham Kuyper and others are very important. But evangelicalism, for those who are not evangelicals or not very familiar with it, is a less institutional form of Christianity. So as opposed to, let's say, the Catholic Church, as we talked about earlier, evangelicals don't have a pope. They don't have a central council. We are much more of a movement of Christians. We have things like a magazine like Christianity Today and some seminaries and colleges and things like that, but we're not a cohesive movement. There's nowhere you can go to get sort of excommunicated from evangelicalism.
Then how do you know how to be an evangelical if there's no source of authority? Like, let's say an individual wants to become a better evangelical and has doubts about their own kind of practice or how they're approaching their faith. I guess they can go to their local pastor, but there isn't really like a deeper source of authority or institutional grounding. I mean, that's always going to be the struggle with evangelical movements.
Yeah. So it is a movement, or as I guess the kids would say, it's a vibe. In that sense. And this is, I think, the great strength of American evangelicalism, and I would say it's its great weakness or its vulnerability today, in that it lacks a thick tradition. Intellectual tradition. Evangelicals historically, when it comes to politics, they've been very issue-based, right? So like in the past it was, well, we don't like alcohol, or we don't like abortion, or we don't like homosexuality, or whatever it is. So evangelicals would get excited about an issue, but they wouldn't really have a political philosophy of sort of, what is the government for? What is the government responsible for? In the same way that perhaps liberalism or conservatism or socialism has like a fully orbed
worldview.
This is what we want the state to do. This is what taxation should be. Evangelicals haven't really had that.
But is that an evangelical problem as much as it is a broader Christian problem, the kind of Christian discomfort with executive authority, with the role of the state? Because Christianity was founded as a dissident movement against the state, that Christianity, at least in the time of Christ and shortly thereafter for the subsequent 2 or 3 centuries, had no role of state power. So it leads to a kind of awkward relationship once you actually do have power.
Yeah, that's a very Muslim question. That's a very Muslim pushback. Yeah, so whereas with Islam began in the very beginning as a political movement, right? Muhammad was a political leader. He was a military leader. He was engaged in questions of taxation and things like that. Yeah. Jesus never collected taxes. Jesus never set up an economic system. Right. He never ruled even a village. So I think that's right, that Christianity, because it didn't have political power for the first 300 years, Christianity has always had a mixed relationship with power. We've always been a little bit ambivalent or uncomfortable with taking political power. At least at our best, we're uncomfortable with it. When we're comfortable with political power is usually
then you start having problems.
We start having problems, right? Yeah. So I think at our best, Christians feel mixed about taking and seizing political power in that kind of way. So yeah, I think that's an inherent tension within the Christian faith. But I think it's a good one. I think it's healthy for human beings to feel quite uncomfortable picking up a sword. I think that's right.
But then isn't part of the problem now that evangelicals, broadly speaking, have become comfortable with political power, that the vast majority of white evangelicals are supporters of Donald Trump, sometimes fervent supporters of Donald Trump? It's become one of the strongest constituencies for MAGA, for the Trump movement, is white evangelicals. So have they lost some of their skepticism about worldly authority, and what's led them to lose that skepticism?
Yeah, I think there's multiple things going on. I think there are evangelicals who are quite comfortable with seizing political power. I think there are other evangelicals, however, who see Donald Trump as a sort of necessary evil. So they're not happy about the choice they've made. I mean, I think about my own evangelical church, my own little evangelical church that I attend in St. Louis. And I think about, there are a lot of Trump voters in my local church. And I think some of them genuinely like Donald Trump and are happy about him.
Yeah.
But I think many more of them were of the opinion that, the left is taking over, the woke are coming, and Donald Trump is sort of our only hope to sort of save America from godlessness. I think it's more of, for many of them, sort of a necessary evil, that we have to take power.
Yeah, and it comes from a perceived sense of weakness that evangelicals have felt under attack for a long time, and have felt like they're marginalized in the broader society, and that secularism has become the dominant worldview or faith, if you will. So they feel embattled, and because they're so embattled, that they have to find some kind of savior figure to kind of pull them back from the brink.
Yeah. I think so. I'm not sure if they would, if these all evangelicals would say Donald Trump is a savior figure. I think, the fervent ones would. I think the others would just use the phrase of sort of like necessary evil,
yeah,
or bulwark, that,
or imperfect vessel.
Yeah, something like that. That we've got to do this because America at this point in history is losing its religious identity, and so it's a necessary evil.
Well, maybe one thing I would want to just ask you about more personally, were you ever tempted by Trump and what he offered? Was there ever a time when you felt that kind of science? Maybe something like that could be interesting. No, we don't have to.
No, that's a good question. It just makes me uncomfortable. So
that means it's good.
That means it's good.
Okay. Because I'm actually not entirely sure what the answer to this is, even though we've known each other for a long time as friends. But was there ever a moment, even earlier on, maybe closer to 2016, 2015, where you might have felt some of the kind of siren call of Donald Trump and what he was offering, where you felt almost tempted despite your better judgment, and you thought like, oh, because you're someone who, for example, you care a lot about issues like abortion.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump was promising a lot by appointing certain kinds of Supreme Court justices.
Yeah.
That there is an argument to be made that he could be a means to a greater end. If your goal is to stop what you see as the killing of live human beings, really,
right,
that if what it takes is someone like Donald Trump to save lives, that could be justified from a moral, even religious perspective. So I'm curious, were you ever close to that kind of thinking yourself?
Yeah. As a conservative evangelical, was I ever tempted?
Yes, indeed.
Tempted in my heart to vote for Donald Trump. Yeah. Thanks for the easy, comfortable question. Well, first off, I'll tell a little story. So on the election night, 2016, I was actually in Amsterdam. And I had signed up to give a lecture in Amsterdam on evangelicals and American politics the very next day, the day after the election. And the lecture hall was filled with all of these Dutch citizens who were asking me, after Donald Trump won, why did American Christians vote for Donald Trump? And they just couldn't understand how could American Christians do this when the man is, the opposite of Christian values in every single way. And of course, in the Netherlands, they have 13 different political parties. They actually have 3 different Christian parties. They have kind of a left-wing Christian party and kind of a right-wing Christian party. And so they have a million choices. And what I said to them in that moment was, here in the Netherlands, you have lots of choices, and you can pick a party that's very closely aligned to you. They have one for the environment and one for workers and one for, animal rights and Christianity and immigration. But in the United States, I said, we only have 2 choices. So you are going to be signing up for someone in the United States who you deeply disagree with on certain issues. So everyone in America is forced to vote against their values in a certain way. So in the Netherlands, voters don't have to compromise themselves when they vote. It's
Right.
actually the 13 different political parties, they have to compromise in order to get anything done. And the opposite is true in America, is that voters have to compromise themselves. And then our political parties don't compromise at all. They don't work together. It's a
good way of putting it. Yeah.
So essentially what has to happen in the heart of an American voter is you have to tear your own heart when you vote, because you have to morally compromise yourself in important ways, unless you're a total ideologue, right? And you just think the Democratic Party is perfection, or you think the Republican Party is perfection. But most of us, when we make a choice for president, we're making an imperfect choice. And so that's a long way to get back to your question of, was I ever tempted by Donald Trump? I would say yes and no. So no, I never found Donald Trump attractive as a leader or as a human being. I've always found him morally repugnant and was never tempted to praise or enjoy Donald Trump. As a Christian, as an ethicist, no. But I was tempted to make the imperfect choice, to sort of say, you know what, I have two choices, and I can see the argument of I am a pro-life Christian, as you said. I view abortion as morally repugnant. And so I think for me, it was tempting in that moment. And the way I described it to my Dutch audience was, imagine you have Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and they have all of their political platforms, all of their things, except Hillary Clinton is in favor of slavery. So she has all of her, healthcare, all the things that she loves, but one line is she is for slavery. Would you still vote for Hillary Clinton? Because for evangelicals, abortion is a moral evil in a similar way that slavery is. So to vote for Hillary Clinton in that moment is to say, I'm siding with a leader who I agree with in every way except for this issue of slavery. And so in that way, I'll answer your question. Yeah, I was tempted because I thought maybe if I elect Donald Trump, we could get a few more steps towards getting rid of abortion.
But then what prevented you from taking that step? Because the logic that you just laid out, I think it can be a defensible argument that if you prioritize one thing over everything else, if you really do see abortion as an abomination at the level of slavery, and I've heard some evangelicals describe it as genocide, mass murder. If you really think mass murder is going on, then you actually should do quite a lot to resist it. I mean, you could even justify potentially taking
up arms.
If you really thought it was mass murder, then maybe you would, take extreme measures to stop it. And one of those measures could be voting for someone like Donald Trump. So, I mean, because this gets me to a broader question of what can evangelicals like you do in the current climate to kind of bring us to some level of sanity on some of these bigger questions. You were able to resist the siren call of Donald Trump in the end, where most of your fellow evangelicals were not able to do that. So is it just something at the level of one's individual personality that it's very specific to you, that you just didn't feel that you could do it?
Yeah.
And it's not something that's necessarily generalizable to like the masses.
Yeah, there was two reasons why I didn't follow that logic. Two reasons why I would never vote for Donald Trump. One is just a fundamental commitment to the future of our democracy. So I want to win that abortion debate democratically. I want to work through the democratic process to do that. And I see Donald Trump as fundamentally endangering the democratic process and democratic institutions. And I don't think of the political issue of abortion as worth getting rid of democracy.
Yeah.
So that's where you and I can connect on that. And the other thing I think is that I believe in order for America to flourish, we need a healthy Republican Party. And we need a healthy conservative movement in America, and we don't have one right now. And I see Donald Trump as an existential threat to the conservative movement itself. I don't believe Donald Trump is a conservative in any meaningful way. And so that was another reason I voted against him, was because I thought he was a cancer to the conservative movement and a cancer to the Republican Party in general. And in that way, he endangers American public life.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to bring up was the question of immigration, which I'm also curious about, because I think evangelicals get a bad rap, and people don't realize that a lot of the refugee resettlement groups in America are led by evangelicals. Yeah. Evangelicals do a lot when it comes to refugees. And there is a tradition of charities abroad as well that are led by evangelicals, and welcoming the stranger,
right,
if you will, from like a kind of Christian perspective. Yet this Trump-led Republican Party has focused so much on immigration as being the defining issue of our time. And I'm curious how you've seen evangelicals square the circle on that, because I think a lot of them would, in theory, like to still welcome some number of refugees and have asylum seekers and people who are really struggling when it comes to that, to have some way to apply to come to America. But you have an administration that is completely against doing that and wants to bring immigration to zero.
Yeah, so there's an evangelical ministry for immigrants and refugees. It's called World Relief. And I would love to have them on the podcast sometime to talk about this problem, because I don't have an answer to your question. And it's a fascinating paradox. On one side of things, American evangelicals, statistically speaking, are very much against immigration. And yet on the other side are incredibly charitable and generous. American evangelicals give more money, volunteer, serve more in protecting refugees and getting them homes. I have many friends who, they when a refugee comes from Syria, they will set up an apartment, they'll get furnishings, they'll get clothes, they'll help the kids get backpacks and go to school. Like, incredible evangelical generosity to these refugees and immigrants. And then also politically, very much anti-immigrant at the same time. And so that's a paradox that has fascinated me. And as someone who's written about evangelicalism, immigration, and hospitality, it's been a fascinating one. I have some answers, but for the most part, it really does perplex me. And then, not to mention just that Christianity itself, Jesus was a refugee.
Right.
He ran away from political terror. He was in danger of being killed by the king, and his family fled to Egypt. He was a refugee there. And the faith itself is a migrant faith. It's a global faith. It's a dynamic faith. And it's one that's missional. So you're supposed to want to, welcome people and tell them the gospel story. So it is quite a paradox.
Yeah, maybe this brings us back to some of what we talked about at the start of the episode, that evangelicalism is being hollowed out, and evangelicals themselves are prioritizing politics over religion, that their fundamental affiliation now is a partisan one to the Republican Party. So whatever the Republican Party believes, if that's a strong and harsh anti-immigration attitude, they'll take that on as their own, because that is their identity. They are part of a tribe. They are part of a MAGA movement or a Trump movement that sees immigration in a particular way. We also know that evangelicals are becoming less practicing, that if you look over time, evangelicals aren't going to church as much as they once did. Evangelical now, some people adopt the label as a political label. They might not even really have any attachment to the evangelical faith, but when they hear the word evangelical, they think evangelical equals support for Trump. Evangelical equals support for the Republican Party. Therefore, I'm an evangelical and I sympathize with that, even if they're not going to church.
Yeah, you get this crazy thing where you have people who call themselves evangelicals. They don't go to church. They don't read the Bible. They don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead.
Right.
I mean, if there's a more central doctrine to the Christian faith, I don't know what is. But we're taking on evangelicalism as a political label that has no belief content to it. So it's a huge issue. So then the question, of course, is what do we do about that, as evangelicals? And I'll go back to my little local church, and my pastor is struggling with this as well. And one of the things that he says, and I think it's really quite wise. He says that when you don't have a community, you find a cause. So it goes back to that loneliness thing that you talked about. When Americans are lonely, when they don't have a community, they will look for a political tribe, sort of something to belong to. And I think that if evangelicalism is ever going to become, a healthy faith movement in America, it's going to have to start with small spiritual communities of depth, practice, study, prayer. It's going to have to return to, honestly, a more institutional form of faith. These evangelicals are going to have to start going to church. They're going to have to start being in Bible studies, and they're going to have to start engaging in some communal forms of discipline. And what I mean by that is, the way that evangelicals are behaving online, the language they use, the way they treat people, they need some communal discipline to speak and treat others in a Christ-like manner. And what's terrible is we have a lot of Christian leaders online who are speaking in a very un-Christ-like manner, in a very unloving manner, and speaking about their opponents in very cruel ways. And so the way for healing for American evangelicals is going to be humility, community, character. And it's a sort of slow thing that is countercultural to, evangelical obsession with growth and strength and beauty and all of those kinds of things. And it's something that my PhD students are working on. They're asking those questions of how do you develop a spiritually healthy citizen who will not sell their soul for a political movement.
But if the answer is institutions, which I think is a good answer, it leads us to a paradox that the very thing that evangelicals need to get back on track is the very thing they're most skeptical of. If evangelicalism is inherently suspicious of institutional structures, then how will they become more grounded in institutions?
Yeah. Well, I think that is what I'm saying is that
they have to find a way
that's
to
the
kind
inherent
of get over that skepticism.
Yeah, that's the inherent weakness of evangelicalism is its individualism. So this belief that it's me and Jesus rather than being in a community. So that's the political instability at the heart of evangelicalism is it's individualistic, it's experiential, anti-intellectual, anti-institutional. And so this is where I come from, the Reformed Presbyterian tradition, which does value education, community, institutions, traditions. And I think that's going to be an important thing, but it can't be just reviving old institutions. It's going to have to be a developing of a sort of new imagination for that. And so we're obviously not going to answer that today, but hopefully in the future we can bring on some evangelicals who are doing that kind of hopeful work of a healthier politics. So I think that about does it for our conversation on, the spirituality of the right. And in our next episode, let's get after the left. I think we've done a good job of offending all of our friends to the right of us. And in our next conversation, why don't we make some enemies to the left? Does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds like a plan. Let's do it.
All right, guys, we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for listening to Zealots at the Gate. If you like what you heard, check out other episodes at comment.org. Zealots at the Gate is hosted by Comment Magazine, produced by Rachel Collins. Technical production is by Ali Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy, and editorial direction by Ann Snyder.